Elizabeth Carter did not cry when she buried her husband. She did not cry when the bank took their house. She did not cry when 4 little boys looked up at her and asked where they were going to sleep. But standing on the platform at Cheyenne Station, holding a single suitcase and 3 days of cold bread, watching a broad-shouldered stranger read the agency letter with his jaw going tight, Elizabeth Carter felt her hands begin to shake. Because she already knew what that look meant. She had seen it her entire life. If you're watching this story and it's already pulling at your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell so you never miss a single episode, and drop a comment below telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Wyoming 1884 and find out what one man's unexpected words changed for a mother who had stopped believing anyone would ever choose her. The letter had been clear. Nathan Cole had read it 4 times before he wrote back to the agency, and he had been careful with every word. He was 38 years old. He owned 400 acres outside Cheyenne. He ran a cattle operation that supported 6 hired hands and produced enough income to be called successful by anyone in Wyoming Territory. He needed a wife, someone who understood ranch work, someone organized, capable, willing to share the practical burdens of a life built on land and livestock. He had not written anything about children. He had been very specific about that. His foreman, Walter Briggs, had been the one to push him toward the agency in the first place. Walter was 52, married 26 years to a woman named Dottie, who sent pie to the bunkhouse every Sunday, and Walter had a habit of watching Nathan eat alone at the long kitchen table and shaking his head slowly, the way a man does when he sees something that troubles him but doesn't know how to say it out loud. "You ain't meant to live like this," Walter had said one evening in late October, standing in the barn doorway with his hat in his hands. "This ranch is fine, the cattle are fine, but a man needs more than fine, Nathan." "I'm doing all right." "You're doing quiet, that's different." Nathan hadn't answered. He'd kept working the harness in his hands, and Walter had eventually walked away because Walter had learned 3 years ago that there were subjects Nathan Cole would not be pushed on. His late wife Clara was one of them. His loneliness was another. They were the same subject, really. But 3 weeks later, Nathan had written the letter. I didn't know exactly why. Maybe it was the November cold settling into the house in a way that felt different from other years. Maybe it was sitting down to a meal his housekeeper, Mrs. Arden, had left on the stove and realizing he hadn't spoken a full sentence to another person in 4 days. Maybe it was just Walter's words sitting in the back of his mind like a stone he couldn't stop turning over. He wanted a wife. He had written it plainly. A capable woman. A widow preferred someone who understood loss and work and didn't expect poetry. Someone who could manage a household, who wasn't afraid of hard winters, who understood that a rancher's life was built around the land first and everything else second. He had mailed the letter and tried not to think too much about it. The agency's reply came 6 weeks later, and it was warm and professional, and said they believed they had found an excellent match. Elizabeth Carter of St. Louis, 34 years old, widowed 2 years prior, former schoolteacher. References described her as organized, steady, hardworking, and gentle-natured. Nathan had read it twice and written back his agreement. He did not read the second page of the agency letter until the night before he was supposed to ride into Cheyenne to meet her train. He found it wedged behind the first page, folded differently, as though someone had tucked it in hastily. And when he unfolded it and read the single paragraph that began with the words, "We feel we must be fully transparent regarding Mrs. Carter's circumstances," Nathan sat down very slowly in the kitchen chair and read it 3 more times. Elizabeth Carter was not arriving alone. She had 4 sons. Samuel, 14 years old. Henry, 11. Thomas, 8. Benjamin, 4. Nathan set the letter down on the table. He sat in the silence of his kitchen for a long time. I was not a man who lost his temper easily, but something moved through him that night that was close to anger. Not at Elizabeth Carter, who had not written the letter and had not made the mistake, but at the situation itself. At the agency's carelessness. At the feeling of having been maneuvered into something without his consent. He had been clear. He had written it plainly. He had not asked for this. He picked up the letter again and read it once more as though the words might change. They didn't. He could send a telegram tonight and cancel everything. He had every right to do that. Any reasonable man would do exactly that. Elizabeth Carter would understand she had probably expected it. Probably had a plan for when the arrangements fell through. Probably had faced worse disappointments than this. He stood up from the table and walked to the window and looked out at the dark ranch, at the shape of the barn against the night sky, at the lights still burning faint in the bunkhouse where his men were asleep. 400 acres. One man. He went to bed without sending the telegram. He told himself he would decide in the morning. But when morning came, he dressed in his good shirt, the dark one he wore into town for business dealings, and he told Walter to mind the ranch, and he saddled his horse and rode into Cheyenne. He still hadn't decided anything. He told himself that on the whole ride in. The Cheyenne train station on a December morning was a noisy, cold, crowded place. Steam and boot heels and men calling to each other across the platform. Nathan stood near the far end of the platform away from the crowd, with his hat pulled low and his hands in his coat pockets, and he watched the train come in. He watched the passengers descend. Business travelers. A family he didn't recognize. A cattle buyer he'd seen at auction twice. And then a woman stepped down from the second car, and Nathan knew immediately it was her. Not because she was beautiful, though she was dark. Chestnut hair, pinned up under a gray bonnet. Pale skin that showed the cold in 2 spots of color high on her cheeks. A face that was young, but had already learned what tired felt like. He knew it was her because of the way she moved. Careful. Deliberate. Like a woman who had learned to take up as little space as possible, so nobody had a reason to make her leave. She was carrying one small suitcase. Behind her came the boys, the oldest one first. Samuel Nathan assumed tall for 14, with his mother's dark hair and a jaw that was already learning to hold itself steady. He came down the steps with his shoulders squared in a way that looked practiced, like he'd been squaring them against things for a long time. He turned immediately and reached back to help the next one down. Henry came next. 11 years old and slight, with wire-rimmed spectacles that were slightly bent on one side, wearing a coat that was too thin for Wyoming in December, and already scanning the platform the way a careful person scans for trouble. Thomas was 8 and held a book under one arm, even stepping off a train, brown-haired and serious-faced, looking around with the wide-eyed attention of a child who notices everything. And last came Benjamin, 4 years old, gripping the railing with both small hands, taking the steps one at a time, with the solemn concentration of someone navigating a very important task. He was wearing a hat 2 sizes too large that kept sliding down over his eyes, and when he reached the platform, he pushed it up with one fist and looked around with an expression of absolute seriousness, as though he had arrived somewhere important and intended to conduct himself accordingly. Nathan watched all of this from 20 feet away. He did not move. Elizabeth Carter had not spotted him yet. She was counting her son's emotions so automatic, Nathan could tell she'd done it 1,000 times. This rapid visual inventory, 1, 2, 3, 4, making sure they were all there, all standing, all whole. When she finished the count, her shoulders came down slightly from where they'd been carrying themselves, that specific release of breath a mother makes when all her children have made it through something. Then she looked up and found him. Nathan didn't know what his face was doing. He wasn't trying to school it into anything. He was just standing there in his good dark shirt with his hands in his coat pockets, and Elizabeth Carter looked at him from 20 feet away, and something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. The recognition of a woman who had been bracing for something and had just confirmed it was coming. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward him. And her 4 sons fell into step behind her, like they'd practiced it, like moving together was something they'd learned to do out of necessity. She stopped 3 feet from him and looked at him directly. Her eyes were gray. Not soft gray, clear gray, the kind of gray that didn't look away. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Mrs. Carter." A pause. The steam from the train drifted between them. "I know what the letter said," she told him. "The second page. I know you read it." Nathan looked at her. "You read my correspondence." "The agency sent me a copy of everything. They thought it was relevant." She kept her chin level. "I'm not going to pretend we arrived under the right circumstances. We didn't. The agency made a mistake, and I know it, and you have every right to send us back." "Back to what?" Nathan said before he decided to say anything. Something moved across her face. Not pain exactly, she was too controlled for that, but something. "That's not your concern," she said quietly. "What is your concern is that you wrote to the agency asking for a wife, not a family. And that's what arrived. And I want you to know that I won't. I won't make this harder than it already is. If you want us to go, we'll go. I'll find something in town. We'll manage." Samuel had moved up alongside his mother without making a sound. He was 14 and trying very hard to look like he was 22, shoulders back, jaw tight, standing close enough to her that his arm almost touched hers. Nathan looked him, and the boy looked back steadily. Not aggressive, just present. Just saying without any words, "I am here. Whatever happens, I am here." Nathan looked at the three younger boys. Henry had his spectacles pushed up and was studying Nathan with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a problem. Thomas was holding his book tighter. Benjamin had taken hold of a fold of his mother's coat and was peering out from around her hip, the too large hat tipped sideways over one eye. Nathan picked up the nearest bag. It was light. Lighter than it should have been for a woman traveling with 4 children, which meant either she traveled very efficiently or she'd had to leave most of what they owned somewhere behind. "My wagon's out front," he said. Elizabeth blinked. "Mr. Cole, it's a cold morning," Nathan said. "We can have this conversation at the ranch where it's warmer, or we can stand here on this platform and have it. Either way, the conversation's going to end the same." He was already walking toward the station exit. He heard behind him the sound of Elizabeth Carter taking a breath, and then the sound of 4 sets of feet following him. He told himself on the drive back to the ranch, the long cold drive over frozen ground with Elizabeth sitting straight-backed beside him on the wagon bench and the boys arranged in the back with the bags between them, that he still hadn't made any decision. That he was just being practical. That it was too cold to have a serious conversation on a train platform, and any reasonable man would have done the same. But when Benjamin, wedged between Samuel and Thomas in the back of the wagon, said in a very small and very serious voice, "Mister, are we going to your house?" Nathan had said, "Yeah," before he'd thought about it. And Benjamin had said, "Good," with the profound satisfaction of a 4-year-old whose most immediate need had just been met. Nathan kept his eyes on the road. The ranch came into view around the long curve past the Hendersons' property, and Nathan watched Elizabeth take it in without turning his head fully toward her. He'd gotten good at watching things sideways at a ranch owner's distance. She looked at the main house first. 2 stories, stone and timber solid. The kind of house that had been built to last and had. Then at the barn, the bunkhouse, the fence lines running out toward the north pasture. "It's a good ranch," she said. "It is. You run cattle." 400 head, about 60 more coming in spring. She nodded, taking them as information rather than impression. "Your letter said you needed someone to manage the household." "That's correct. Supply records, meal planning, management of the domestic budget. Among other things." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I was a school teacher for 7 years before I married. Before my husband, before I moved to St. Louis." She paused. "I know how to run a household. I know how to keep accounts. I know how to make food stretch, and how to keep a schedule, and how to manage people who'd rather not be managed." A beat. "My sons included." Nathan glanced at her sideways. She was still looking at the ranch, still taking inventory. But there was something different in her face now, not the careful blankness from the train platform. Something more honest. Something that looked like a woman assessing whether something could work. "The boys are good," she said, almost to herself. They've had a hard 2 years, but they're good." Nathan pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the main house. He set the brake. "I didn't get down right away." He sat with the reins in his hands and looked out at his land for a moment, and then he said without looking at her, "What happened to their father?" She was quiet long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. "Fever," she said. 2 winters ago. It came fast. Samuel was there when—" She stopped. "Samuel was 12. Nathan didn't say anything. He got down from the wagon and went to help the boys with the bags. The inside of the house was warm. Mrs. Arden had been that morning, he could tell, because there was a fire going in the main room and the kitchen had been tidied. But it was also the inside of a house where one person had lived alone for 3 years, which meant it was clean in a functional way and empty in an emotional way. No pictures, no small objects, no evidence of a life that involved other people. Elizabeth stood in the doorway of the main room and looked at it. Nathan watched her take it in. "You can use any of the rooms upstairs," he said. "There are 3. The boys can have the 2 at the back." "And if you decide," she started. "Mrs. Carter." He set the last bag down. "I'm not going to decide anything tonight. You've been on a train for 3 days with 4 children. Let's get you all fed and warmed up, and then we can talk about what makes sense." She looked at him. That steady gray gaze. "You're a fair man," she said quietly. It didn't sound like flattery. It sounded like an observation, and slightly like it surprised her. "I try to be," Nathan said. He went to put the horse up. Dinner that night was the first meal Nathan Cole had eaten in 3 years with other people at his table. He was aware of this in a specific, uncomfortable way, aware of how the space that had been only his silence was now filled with sound. Benjamin narrating the contents of his plate with great seriousness. Thomas asking 3 questions about the ranch before the food was even served. Henry eating quietly with his spectacles slightly fogged from the steam and watching everything. Samuel not saying much but watching Nathan the way a 14-year-old watches a man he's trying to evaluate. Elizabeth said, "Samuel," once quietly, when the boy's attention was becoming too obvious. Samuel looked at his plate. Nathan pretended he hadn't noticed. After dinner, when the younger boys had been settled upstairs and Samuel had gone up with them, reluctantly staying close to his brothers, with the specific vigilance of a child who has learned that adults don't always do what they're supposed to. Elizabeth came back down to the kitchen. Nathan was at the table with his account books. She poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, which struck him for a moment, the easy assumption that she could. The way it felt both presumptuous and completely natural, and she sat down across from him. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. "What actually needs doing. Not the summary version, the real one." Nathan looked up at her. "Most people don't want the real version," he said. "I'm not most people," she said evenly. "I've got 4 sons and 1 suitcase, and I've started over twice already. I'd rather know exactly what I'm dealing with than find it out sideways." Nathan studied her for a moment. Then he pushed the account books toward her. She pulled them over without hesitation and started reading. He watched her face as she read, the small focused crease between her brows, the slight movement of her lips as she worked through the numbers, the moment when she found the supply records, and her expression shifted to something that was almost, he wasn't sure, it might have been exasperation. "These records," she said. "I know. These have not been properly kept in 2 years, roughly." She looked up at him. "How are you managing your purchasing without accurate records?" "Memory and guesswork, mostly guesswork." She stared at him. "I know," he said again. "Mr. Cole." She closed the book carefully, which he somehow understood was restraint. "I can fix these. It will take time and you'll need to answer some questions about what you've actually spent in the last 2 years, but I can fix this." "I expect you can," he said. A silence. "Why did you bring us to the ranch?" she asked. "Tonight, I mean. You could have made the decision on the platform. It would have been easier." Nathan was quiet for a moment. He thought about Benjamin's voice in the back of the wagon. "Good," said with the absolute uncomplicated trust of a 4-year-old who had just been told he was going somewhere that qualified as a house. "It was cold," he said. Elizabeth Carter looked at him for a long moment. "That's not why," she said. He didn't argue with her. She finished her coffee and said goodnight and went upstairs. Nathan sat alone at his table with his account books for a while after that. The fire was burning lower. The house was quieter, but it was a different kind of quiet than it had been for 3 years. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of people sleeping, of breath moving through rooms, of presence. He told himself he hadn't decided anything. But he sat there for another hour, without opening the account books, listening to the house around him, and at some point he realized he had not once thought about sending a telegram. He put the books away and went to bed. Upstairs through the wall, he could hear the faint murmur of Elizabeth's voice. She was talking to one of the boys. He couldn't tell which one, the words too soft to make out. Just the sound of it. Just the low, steady reassurance of a mother telling her children they were all right. Nathan lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling. He had not made any decisions. But the house felt different than it had that morning. He wasn't sure yet if that was a good thing or a terrible thing. He fell asleep before he could decide. Across the hall, in the room where Samuel had put his brothers to bed, Thomas curled against the wall with his book still in his hands. Benjamin burrowed under every blanket he could find. Henry breathing slow and even with his spectacles folded on the bedside table. Samuel sat on the edge of his own mattress in the dark. He had his mother's habit of counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. Making sure everyone was there. He looked at the window. At the dark Wyoming sky outside, faint stars through the glass. He thought about the man downstairs. Nathan Cole. The way he'd picked up the bag without saying anything. The way he'd said yeah when Benjamin asked if they were going to his house. The way at dinner he'd pushed the bread toward Thomas without being asked when it was clear Thomas wanted more and was too nervous to say so. Samuel had watched men his whole life. He was trying to figure out what kind of man this one was. He didn't know yet. But he thought about what his mother had said to him on the train when he'd asked her what they would do if the rancher turned them away. She'd said, "We'll manage, Samuel. We always manage." And he'd said, "I know. But what if we don't have to?" She'd looked at him a long time after that. He pulled off his boots and lay down on top of the blankets with his arms behind his head, listening to Benjamin breathe, and Thomas shift in his sleep, and Henry's steady quiet. 1, 2, 3, 4. All here. He closed his eyes. Downstairs, the fire burned low in the main room of the Cole ranch. Outside Wyoming, winter pressed against every wall, and the wind moved through the dark fields, and the cattle shifted in the barn, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called once and went silent, and for the first time in 3 years, every room in Nathan Cole's house had someone in it. Nathan Cole woke before dawn the next morning, the way he always did, not gradually, not gently, but all at once, like a switch thrown. He was dressed and downstairs with his boots on before the sky had started to lighten, moving through the kitchen the way he'd moved through it for 3 years, quiet, automatic, alone. Except the kitchen was not the way he'd left it. Someone had been up before him. The supply ledger he'd left closed on the far end of the table was now open, and beside it were 2 sheets of paper covered in neat, close handwriting. Columns of figures, cross-references, notations in the margins. A pencil lay across the top sheet at the precise angle of something set down deliberately, not dropped. The coffee pot was on the stove and already warm to the touch. Nathan stood in the middle of his kitchen and looked at this evidence of another person and felt something he couldn't immediately name. He poured himself a coffee and sat down and looked at the papers. Elizabeth Carter had been awake in the small hours of the morning, going through records he hadn't properly maintained in 2 years, and she had organized 2 pages of findings before anyone else in the house had stirred. He read through the first column. She had cross-referenced his livestock costs against his purchasing dates and found 3 months where he'd been double-billed by his feed supplier. A discrepancy small enough that he'd never noticed and significant enough that added up, it amounted to real money. I was still reading when he heard her on the stairs. She came into the kitchen dressed and ready, hair up, wearing an apron. Already she must have found it in the drawer beside the stove where Mrs. Arden kept the household things, and she stopped when she saw him at the table with the papers. "I should have asked," she said immediately. "I'm sorry. I woke up at 3 and couldn't go back to sleep, and the records were sitting there and I just—" She stopped herself. "I should have asked." "You found a billing error," Nathan said. She came forward and looked at the page he was holding. 3 of them, actually. Same supplier. "It looks like a calculation mistake on their end, not deliberate, but over 4 months you've been overpaying." She pointed to a figure in the second column. "That's the total discrepancy." Nathan looked at the number. "When were you going to bring this up?" he asked. "I just did," she said. He looked up at her. There was something in her expression that was not quite a challenge, but was in that neighborhood a woman who had done something useful and was waiting to see whether she would be thanked for it or told she'd overstepped. Like she'd gotten those two responses in about equal measure over the course of her life and wasn't sure which one was coming. "I'll send a letter to the supplier today," Nathan said. Something eased in her face. "I can draft it if you'd like," she said. "I have a particular way of writing these kinds of letters." A slight pause. "They tend to get results." He believed her. She went to the stove and started on breakfast, and Nathan sat at his table and drank his coffee, and neither of them said anything for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence two people settle into when they are both busy and both competent, and don't need to fill the air with noise to prove they're getting along. He was almost used to it when Benjamin appeared in the kitchen doorway. The boy was in his nightshirt with his too large hat somehow already on his head. Nathan had no idea when he'd acquired the attachment to that hat, and he was carrying a blanket that dragged behind him on the floor, and he walked directly to the table and climbed into a chair with the patient deliberateness of someone who had decided this was the place to be and saw no reason to explain himself. Nathan looked at him. Benjamin looked back with complete seriousness and said, "Is there eggs?" "Benjamin," Elizabeth said from the stove without turning around. "I'm asking politely," Benjamin said with great dignity. "There's eggs," Nathan said. Benjamin nodded, satisfied, and arranged his blanket around himself in the chair. Nathan looked at this 4-year-old sitting at his kitchen table wrapped in a blanket and wearing a hat, and felt something happen in his chest that he didn't examine too closely. The rest of the boys came down 20 minutes later. Samuel first, already dressed and clearly having been awake for a while, then Henry with his spectacles on and his hair damp, and Thomas last with the book from last night still in his hand, and the particular expression of someone who had been awake reading until very late and was trying not to show it. Nathan's kitchen, which had been silent for 3 years, was suddenly full of voices. "Thomas, you were reading past midnight," Samuel said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact delivered with the weariness of someone who had been monitoring this situation for some time. "I was not," Thomas said. "Your candle burned down to the last inch. I could see the light under the door." "I fell asleep reading. That's different." "It's not different." "Boys," Elizabeth said. They both said yes, ma'am, with the automatic compliance of children who knew exactly which tone of voice required immediate response. Nathan watched all of this over his coffee cup. Henry had gone directly to the stove to watch what Elizabeth was cooking. Not intruding, just standing nearby with his hands clasped behind his back in the manner of someone deeply interested in a process. After a moment, he said in a very careful voice, "Mrs. Mama, the pan is tilted." Elizabeth tilted the pan without missing a beat. "Thank you, Henry." Henry nodded and stepped back, satisfied. Nathan filed this away. Henry noticed things. Henry corrected things. Henry did it quietly so no one had to feel bad about missing it. After breakfast, Nathan told his men what needed doing for the day. Walter taking the north fence line, the other hands splitting between the cattle and the equipment that needed winterizing. And he came back to the house to find Elizabeth at the kitchen table, with the ledger open, and both pages of her notes spread out, and a third sheet started. Samuel was beside her, not sitting down, but standing with one hand on the table, and leaning over to look at what she was writing. "This column," Samuel was saying, "if that number's the monthly cost, then this one here should be the quarterly. Quarterly plus the variable," Elizabeth said, writing. "See how the spring purchase changes the baseline." "Oh," Samuel said. "Then, that's actually, yeah, that makes sense." Nathan stood in the doorway and watched his 14-year-old stepson, who was not yet his stepson, learning ranch accounting from his wife, who was not yet his wife, and neither of them had noticed him come in. He went back outside. I wasn't sure what he was supposed to do with what he was feeling. He was standing at the fence when Walter came up beside him, having apparently forgotten something at the barn, and took one look at Nathan's face and said, "You got a problem?" "No," Nathan said. Walter looked at the house. "How's she doing?" "She found a billing error in the feed accounts before sunrise this morning." Walter was quiet for a second. "Before sunrise." "Before sunrise." Walter made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Lord Almighty. She also reorganized the supply column structure and drafted a corrective letter to Morrison Feed that I think might actually frighten him into compliance. Nathan. What? You look like a man who just realized he's in over his head. I'm not in over my head, Nathan said. He stopped. She's not what I expected. No, Walter said in the tone of someone exercising great restraint. You expected a woman who ignored billing errors and didn't know how accounts worked. I didn't expect. Nathan stopped again. Walter waited. She woke up at 3 a.m, Nathan said, because she couldn't sleep, and instead of just lying there, she got up and fixed a problem I didn't even know I had. Walter was quiet for a moment. Then, what's the problem with that? There's no problem with it. You sure? Nathan looked at him. Go check the north fence, Walter. Walter went, but Nathan could see from 20 yards away that he was smiling. The first real collision came 3 days later. Not a fight exactly. More like two people walking in opposite directions through a narrow doorway, and neither one willing to step back first. Nathan had a way of running the ranch that had evolved over 8 years of ownership and 3 years of living alone. A system that was his own, shaped around his habits, his schedule, his particular ways of managing his men and his time. He didn't post schedules or explain his plans. He knew what needed doing, and he did it, and he expected the people around him to understand the rhythm by observation and keep up. Elizabeth Carter had run a household with 4 children and a husband who, by the gentle way she avoided discussing him, had apparently required managing along with everything else. She made lists. She posted schedules. She asked questions at the beginning of the day so she knew what to plan for. She communicated. These two approaches met head-on the 3rd morning when Nathan came in from the barn at midday and found that Elizabeth had rearranged the kitchen storage. Not drastically. She hadn't moved furniture or changed anything structural. She had reorganized the shelving so that the dry goods were grouped by use rather than by however they'd ended up where they were, which was, Nathan could admit privately, mostly random. She had labeled 3 jars. She had put the account books in a dedicated space on the side shelf where they could be reached without clearing the whole table. Nathan stood in the kitchen looking at this. Elizabeth came in from the main room and saw his face. I should have asked, she said for the 2nd time in 3 days. This is my kitchen, Nathan said. He hadn't meant it to come out quite like that. It came out like that. She stopped. Her chin came up slightly, not aggressive, just level. Just a woman finding her footing. You're right, she said. It is your kitchen, and I should have asked. But Mr. Cole, I made breakfast for 6 people this morning, and supper for 6 last night. And the way the storage was organized, I spent 40 minutes combined searching for things that should have been findable in 40 seconds. I wasn't trying to take over your kitchen. I was trying to make it work. A silence. Nathan looked at the shelves. Then he looked at her. The account books, he said. What about them? That's a better place for them. Something flickered in her expression. I thought so. The rest of it, if you're going to be cooking in here, you should have it the way that works for you. He paused. You could have told me what you wanted moved. You were in the barn before dawn and didn't come in until now, she said with measured patience. I would have needed to go to the barn. That's where I work, he said. I know, she said. Which is why I made a decision rather than wait. I made the wrong call. I'll ask next time. He looked at her. She looked at him. It was not a warm moment, but it was an honest one, and he found somewhat to his own surprise that he preferred honest to warm. Fine, he said. Fine, she agreed. Neither of them apologized exactly, but they'd said what needed saying, and they both seemed to understand that, and she went back to what she'd been doing, and he poured himself water from the pitcher and went back to the barn. And when he came in that evening, the kitchen smelled like stew and fresh bread, and Benjamin was sitting on the floor near the stove, narrating a private story to a wooden spoon he'd apparently adopted as a companion. Nathan stepped over the wooden spoon and its keeper without comment and sat down at his table. Thomas appeared at his elbow. Mr. Cole, Thomas said, how many head of cattle did you say you had? 400. And how much land per head is recommended for winter grazing? Nathan looked down at him. Thomas was 8 years old, and looking up with the expression of someone who had been thinking about this question for some time, and was relieved to finally be able to ask it. "Where'd you read about winter grazing ratios?" Nathan said. "The book you left on the table, the Farming Almanac, Chapter 11. Nathan thought back. He'd left that almanac on the side table 3 days ago because he'd been looking something up and then gotten distracted. He hadn't thought about it since. "You read Chapter 11, he said. "Chapters 8 through 14, Thomas said honestly. "Chapter 11 is about winter grazing management. Chapter 12 is about fence maintenance in frozen ground, which Henry found very interesting." He adjusted his book. "So how much land do you have per head?" Nathan did the math in his head. Then he told Thomas. Thomas thought about this seriously. "That's below the recommended ratio for Wyoming winters," he said. "I know," Nathan said. "That's why we supplement with stored feed." "Chapter 13, Thomas said immediately. "Yes," Nathan said. Thomas nodded slowly, processing this, and Nathan watched him working through it. This small, serious-faced boy, doing genuine agricultural arithmetic in his head at the dinner table, and felt something loosen slightly in the part of him that had been keeping a careful distance. "You can borrow the almanac," Nathan said, "if you want to read the rest of it." Thomas looked up at him with an expression that was trying very hard to stay calm, and not quite succeeding. "Really?" "It's just sitting there," Nathan said. Thomas picked up the almanac from where it apparently already in his hands. Nathan noticed had been there all along, and held it with the reverence of a child receiving something valuable. "Thank you," he said very seriously. Nathan looked at his plate. Elizabeth across the table was looking at something in the middle distance with an expression he couldn't read. When she noticed him noticing, she looked back at her plate. Neither of them said anything. But that was the third night, and it was different from the first. Henry found the broken fence bracket on the fourth morning. Nathan had known about it. It was on his list, the east gate bracket that had worked itself loose over the fall and needed rebolting before the hard freeze made it worse, but it was one of a dozen things on a list he'd been working through. When he got to the east gate, the bracket had already been rebolted and done neatly with the right hardware, and with a small additional brace that Nathan had not thought to add, but immediately recognized as a good idea. He stood and looked at this repair. He went and found Henry in the barn. Henry was 11 years old and slight, and wore bent spectacles, and had apparently spent the previous afternoon finding and fixing the east gate bracket on the grounds that it was loose and loose things ought to be fixed. "The brace," Nathan said. "That was your addition." Henry pushed his spectacles up. The original bolt configuration had only one point of contact with the post. In frozen ground with ice expansion, a single contact point is insufficient. He said all of this in the flat, certain tone of someone relaying a fact rather than making an argument. 2 points distribute the load. It'll hold better." Nathan looked at him. "You know about load distribution." "I read," Henry said simply. "What do you read?" Henry listed without hesitation a book on mechanical principles he'd found at a library in St. Louis. It was 3 issues of a mechanical trade publication. His father had subscribed to the Farming Almanac Nathan had left on the table, which he'd apparently gotten to before Thomas had, and a catalog for agricultural equipment that he'd studied primarily for the technical specifications in the appendix. Nathan listened to all of this. "Come here," he said. I took Henry to the equipment shed and showed him the hay press that had been misbehaving since October, a tension problem. Nathan had diagnosed it as that, but hadn't found the time to properly address it. He explained what was happening. Henry crouched down beside the mechanism and looked at it with his head tilted and his spectacles slipping and one hand hovering but not touching, just following the line of the thing with his eyes. "It's not tension," Henry said. "It's the alignment on the secondary arm. If the tension were the problem, it would be inconsistent. This is consistent, which means it's positional." Nathan crouched beside him. Henry pointed carefully to a pin joint, 3 components, into the mechanism. Nathan looked at it. He had walked past this piece of equipment 40 times in 2 months and had been solving the wrong problem. "You're right," he said. Henry looked at him with the expression of a child who is not used to being told that and doesn't quite know what to do with it. "We'll fix it this afternoon," Nathan said. "You'll help me." Henry nodded. His expression was still careful, still controlled. But something in it had changed. Something had been allowed to be a little more open, like a window pushed up an inch to let air in. That afternoon, they fixed the hay press together. Nathan explained what he was doing as he did it, not in a teaching a child way, but in the way he would explain to another man working alongside him, and Henry worked and listened, and twice made suggestions that Nathan incorporated without discussion because they were simply correct. When they were done, Henry tested the mechanism 3 times, watching the motion with the focused attention of an engineer checking his work. "That's it," Henry said. "That's it," Nathan confirmed. Henry looked at the repaired mechanism, and then at Nathan, and then quickly away, pushing his spectacles up. "Thank you," Henry said very quietly, "for asking me." Nathan started putting tools away. "Good eye," he said. "You keep that eye." Henry picked up a wrench and handed it to him. Handle first, and Nathan took it, and neither of them said anything else, and it was enough. Elizabeth watched Nathan with her sons, the way she watched everything carefully, from the right distance, with the attention of a woman who had learned that what people did when they thought they weren't being observed was the truest version of them. She watched him push bread toward Thomas. She watched him crouch in the equipment shed with Henry for an entire afternoon. She watched him let Benjamin sit at his table every morning without once suggesting the boy should be elsewhere. She watched him not flinch when the house became loud and full, and entirely unlike the silence he'd built himself. But she also watched him at night when the boys were upstairs, and the house settled back into quiet, and Nathan would sit at his table with his account books and his careful, solitary expression. And she could see very clearly that this was a man who had decided 3 years ago that the inside of himself was a place no one else was allowed to go. She understood that decision. She had made a version of it herself. On the 5th night, she sat across from him at the table with her mending, and he was going through his books, and the fire was low, and the house quiet, and she said without looking up, "What was her name?" The room went still. She felt him go still. "Clara," he said after a moment. She nodded and kept her eyes on her mending. "How long were you married?" 9 years. "Did you have—" She stopped herself. She had heard enough of silences like his to know what that particular hesitation usually meant. "I'm sorry. You don't have to answer." "We lost a child," Nathan said. His voice was level. "A boy. Early on. Clara couldn't after that. There were no more." Elizabeth's hands stilled on the mending. She didn't look up because she understood instinctively that he needed to not be looked at while he said these things. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago," he said. "It doesn't work like that," she said quietly. "Long time ago doesn't mean smaller. It just means you've had longer to carry it." A silence. "No," Nathan said. "It doesn't." She looked up then, because something in his voice had shifted, moved from careful to honest in the space of a single word, and he was looking at the table in front of him with an expression she recognized. The expression of a person who has just said something true and is somewhat startled to find they've said it. "Benjamin?" Nathan said suddenly, like he needed to move away from where they'd just been. "This morning at breakfast, he told me his hat belonged to his father." Elizabeth felt her chest tighten. "He told you that—" "He said his papa wore it. Said it was too big because he was going to grow into it." Nathan paused. He said it like it was a fact he was proud of. Elizabeth set down her mending. "James was a good man," she said. He wasn't always strong, but he was good, and he loved those boys." She was quiet for a moment. "Benjamin doesn't really remember him, not truly. He was 2 when James got sick, but Samuel talks about him. Henry writes things down so he doesn't forget. And Benjamin has the hat." She folded her hands in her lap. "We all found our way to carry him." Nathan was looking at her. She met his gaze. "That's why the hat matters so much to him," Nathan said. It wasn't a question. He was understanding something, filing it in the particular way she'd noticed he filed important things quietly without fanfare, but permanently. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. The fire crackled. I won't let anyone make him feel ridiculous for wearing it, Nathan said. It was such a specific, plain, direct statement. Such a Nathan Cole thing to say, not, I'll protect him, or he's safe here, but this precise concrete commitment about one hat. Something cracked open in Elizabeth Carter that she'd been holding very carefully shut. Thank you, she said. It came out smaller than she intended. Rougher. Nathan looked back at his books, but his jaw was different. His whole face was different, marginally 1 degree warmer, like a room someone just walked into and started a fire. She picked her mending back up. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved across the 400 acres of Cole Ranch, and inside in the warm kitchen, 2 carefully guarded people sat across a table from each other and did not talk about anything important for the rest of the evening. But something had changed. They both knew it. They were careful not to say so. The real test came on the 8th morning. Samuel had been up since before Nathan, which Nathan discovered when he went to the barn and found 2 of his horses already fed and watered and the stall nearest the east door freshly cleaned. He stood in the barn aisle and looked at the cleaned stall and then looked until he found Samuel at the far end of the barn doing something with the harness rack. Samuel. The boy turned. His expression was the one he wore when he was preparing for a conversation he expected to lose. You did the morning feeding, Nathan said. Yes, sir. Did your mother ask you to? No, sir. Samuel set down what he was holding. I woke up early, and I thought I wanted to be useful. I know you feed before sunrise, and I thought if I did it, you'd have more time for the other things. Nathan looked at him. I have a schedule, Nathan said. The feeding's part of it. If I come to the barn and the horses are already fed, I don't know if it was done right, if there were any problems I need to know about. Charlie was favoring his left foreleg this morning, Samuel said immediately. I checked it. There's nothing visible, no swelling, no heat. But he didn't want his full weight on it when I led him to water. I think it might be the cold on an old injury. Nathan crossed the barn and went to Charlie's stall. He checked the foreleg, ran his hand down the bone pressed at the joint, watched the horse's reaction. Slight flinch at the fetlock. Samuel was right. Cold on an old injury. Nathan straightened up. What's the old injury? Samuel asked from behind him genuinely. Caught a wire fence 3 years ago, Nathan said. It healed, but the cold gets into it sometimes. He turned around. Good catch. Samuel's shoulders, which had been pulled up slightly in the way of a boy waiting for a verdict, came down. Thank you, sir, he said. Don't call me sir, Nathan said. It makes me feel like a judge. Something that might have been the very early stages of a smile moved across Samuel's face. What should I call you? Nathan thought about this. It was not a simple question, and they both knew it. Nathan's fine, he said. Not Mr. Cole. Not anything else. Just Nathan. They both understood the weight of that, and neither of them made it bigger than it needed to be. Nathan, Samuel said, carefully testing it. Then, can I ask you something? Go ahead. Are we staying? Samuel asked. Flat, direct. The question of a 14-year-old who had decided he was tired of not knowing and was going to ask the thing nobody else would ask. I mean, are you going to let us stay? Really stay, not just until you decide. Nathan looked at him. He thought about what he'd told himself every day since the train station, that he hadn't decided anything, that he was being practical, that this was temporary until he figured out the right arrangement. He thought about Henry's face in the equipment shed, Thomas with the almanac, Benjamin at his kitchen table with his father's hat, Elizabeth in his kitchen before sunrise fixing a problem he didn't know he had. He thought about how his house felt at night now, with breath moving through every room. Yeah, Nathan said. You're staying. Samuel stared at him. Really, Nathan said. Something happened in Samuel's face that was terrible and wonderful in equal measure. This crack in the careful composure of a 14-year-old who had been holding himself together for 2 years, who had squared his shoulders on a train platform against every bad thing that might come, and who was now looking at a man who had just said, "You're staying," with the same plain certainty. He said everything else. Samuel turned away. He stood with his back to Nathan and his hands at his sides and was very still for about 10 seconds. Then he turned back around. His eyes were dry. His jaw was steady. He had found his composure again, though it was slightly different now, lighter, like something had been taken out of it that had been weighing it down. "Okay," he said. "What else needs doing this morning?" Nathan handed him a brush. "Start with the bay," he said. "I'll do the roan." They worked side by side in the barn for the next hour, not saying much, and it was the most natural hour Nathan had spent in 3 years. He did not think about the telegram he hadn't sent. He did not think about decisions he had or hadn't made. He thought about Charlie's foreleg, and the east fence bracket, and the billing error in the feed accounts, and the almanac chapters, 8 through 14, and a 4-year-old in his father's hat, and he worked. And somewhere in that hour, without any ceremony or announcement, the Cole Ranch acquired 4 more people. They just hadn't gotten around to saying it out loud yet. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Nathan was in the barn when Walter brought it up from the post road, and he knew from the way Walter held it at a slight distance from his body, like something that might bite, that it wasn't ordinary mail. The envelope was cream-colored and heavy-printed with the return address of the Hartwell Marriage Agency in St. Louis, and it was addressed to Mrs. Elizabeth Carter, care of Nathan Cole, Cole Ranch, Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory. Nathan took it and held it and did not open it. He brought it to Elizabeth at noon. She was at the kitchen table going through the winter supply calculations, and Samuel was beside her, the way he'd taken to being in the mornings, not hovering, just present, learning the numbers without making a performance of it. When Nathan set the envelope on the table between them, Elizabeth looked at it and went very still. Samuel looked at his mother's face, then at the envelope, then at Nathan. "I'll go check on the horses," Samuel said, and left without being asked. Nathan sat down across from Elizabeth. She hadn't touched the envelope. "You going to open it?" Nathan said. "I know what it is," she said. "You don't know that." She looked at him with the expression she wore when she was being patient with something she considered slightly wrong. "I know what it is, Nathan." He waited. She picked up the envelope and opened it with the precise, unhurried movements of someone who had decided to face something squarely and was going to do it without flinching. She unfolded the letter. She read it. Her face didn't change. That was the thing about Elizabeth Carter. Her face rarely changed. Whatever moved through her, deep below the surface, and you had to know where to look. Nathan was learning where to look. Her hands tightened on the paper. Just slightly, just enough. "The agency," she said, "has found another placement. For you, for me and the boys." She set the letter on the table and smoothed it flat with one hand, a gesture that had nothing to do with the paper and everything to do with controlling something. "A businessman in Denver, a Mr. Gerald Whitmore, 51 years old, widower, no children. He has a house in the city and significant financial holdings, and he's requested—" She stopped. She looked at the letter for a moment. "He's requested a family. He wants the boys included. The agency thought I should know given—" She stopped again. "Given the circumstances of how you came here," Nathan finished. "Yes." Nathan looked at the letter. He didn't pick it up. "What does the house look like?" he said. She blinked. "What?" "The house. Does the letter say what the house looks like?" "Nathan, that's not. Does it?" She looked at the letter. "It says it's a large home, fully staffed, in a good part of Denver, indoor heating." She paused. "Running water." Nathan nodded slowly. "No hard winters," he said. "No cattle. No—" He gestured at the kitchen, at the house, at all of it. "No, any of this." "No," she said quietly. He stood up from the table. He walked to the window, not to look at anything, just to be facing away from her while he got his face in order. He had known something like this might happen. He was not a stupid man. He'd understood from the beginning that what he'd offered Elizabeth Carter was a difficult life on a working ranch in a Wyoming winter, and that a woman with 4 boys and real intelligence, and the kind of competence she had in every room she walked into, was not going to go unnoticed by a world that had other options to put in front of her. He'd known it. Knowing it and standing in his kitchen, hearing it, were 2 different things. "You should think about it carefully," he said to the window. "I am thinking about it." A house in Denver with indoor heating and a staff is not nothing, he said. For 4 boys. I know what it is, she said. He turned around. She was still at the table, still very straight-backed, and still with the letter under one hand, and her eyes on him. What do you want me to say? She asked. Not challenging. Honest. The way she asked everything directly, without decoration. I want you to tell me what you actually want, Nathan said. Not what makes sense, not what's practical, what you want. She looked at him for a long moment. That's the first time anyone's asked me that in a very long time, she said. The words landed quietly, and then kept landing. Nathan held her gaze. Well, I'm asking. She was quiet for 10 seconds. 15. The kind of silence that has weight. I want to know if you want us here, she said finally. Not because it's practical. Not because the accounts are better now, or because Samuel can help in the barn, or because Benjamin makes you... She stopped herself. I want to know if you want us here, as a family, as something real. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside. Nathan could hear one of the hands calling to another across the yard. The ordinary sounds of the ranch going on around them, as if nothing of significance was happening inside the house. I told Samuel you were staying, Nathan said. She stared at him. When? 8 days ago, in the barn. You told Samuel before you told me. I told Samuel when he asked. And you didn't think to. You hadn't asked, he said. A pause. Something shifted in her expression. Not anger, not quite something more complicated than anger. The look of a woman recalibrating. I'm asking now, she said. I know, he said. And the answer is the same. She looked at the letter under her hand. Denver, she said as though testing the word. Denver, he said. She folded the letter. She folded it in half, and then in half again, with the same precise movements she'd used to open it, and she set it on the far edge of the table. I'll need to write a response to the agency, she said. All right, he said, declining the placement. All right, he said again, and something in his chest that had been pulled tight since Walter brought the envelope up from the road went loose. He didn't make a show of it. Neither did she. That was something he was starting to understand about Elizabeth Carter. She did not make shows of things. She decided, and she moved. It was one of the most valuable qualities he had ever encountered in another person. She picked up her pencil and went back to the winter supply figures. Nathan poured himself water and went back to work. It was not a romantic's moment. Nothing between them had been exactly. But it was something true, and in his experience, true things were worth more than romantic ones. He was at the door when she said without looking up, Nathan. He stopped. Thank you, she said, for asking what I wanted. He put his hat on and went out. The storm came without much warning 4 days later. Wyoming winters were not gentle, and Nathan had lived through enough of them to read the sky the way another man might read a newspaper. But this one moved faster than he'd expected, faster than the usual cold fronts that built for days before they hit. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and the wind had turned ugly, and the sky was the color of dirty iron in every direction. Nathan came in from the north pasture and went directly to Walter. Move the cattle to the south shelter. All of them. Right now. Already started, Walter said, because Walter had also been reading Wyoming Winters for 30 years. The east fence. I know. Henderson and Pruitt are on it. The gate bracket. Henry's modification, Walter said, and almost smiled. That'll hold. Nathan nodded and went for his horse. Elizabeth met him in the yard. How bad, she said. Bad enough, he said. Stay inside. Keep the boys inside. I know how to manage 4 boys in a storm, she said. And she did. And he knew she did. And they both understood this exchange was less about the boys and more about the particular human need to say something when you're worried and can't do anything about it. I'll be back, he said. She didn't say be careful or anything like it. She said, the stew will be ready at 6, and went back inside, which was Elizabeth Carter's way of saying the same thing. He rode out. He was 3/4 of the way through moving the last group of cattle to the south shelter when he realized there was someone behind him. He didn't hear it at first over the wind. He felt it the particular way a horse moves when it knows there's another animal behind it, a slight shift in gait. He turned in the saddle, and through the driving cold, he made out a second horse, and on it, a figure in a coat too light for the weather, with his hat pulled down over his ears. Samuel. Nathan swung his horse around. Samuel pulled up beside him. His face reddened from the cold. His expression set with the specific determination of someone who knew they were going to be in trouble and had decided it was worth it. "Go back to the house," Nathan said. "I can help," Samuel said. "Samuel. There's 12 head not in the shelter yet." Samuel pointed into the driving wind. "I can see them from here. If we split up, we can move them faster." Nathan looked at the cattle, looked at the sky, looked at Samuel. "You know how to cut cattle," he said. "I watched you for 2 weeks," Samuel said. "Watching and doing." "I know how to do it," Samuel said. Not bragging, just stating. "My father had a small property. Before the money ran out, I helped him." His jaw tightened slightly. "Let me help." The wind hit them sideways. The cattle were moving the wrong direction. Nathan made the decision the way he made all decisions under pressure, fast and without second guessing. "Take the left flank," he said. "Push them toward the shelter opening. Don't get in front of them. If any of them break right, let them go and we'll get them after." "Understood," Samuel said and wheeled his horse left. They worked the cattle through the storm for 40 minutes, and Samuel was good at it. Not experienced, not skilled. The way a boy who'd grown up on cattle would be, but instinctively good. The kind of natural ability that comes from watching carefully and thinking clearly and not panicking when animals did unpredictable things. He made 2 mistakes. He corrected both of them without being told. He kept his position, kept his focus, kept moving. When the last of the cattle were in the shelter and the gate was latched, they pulled their horses up side by side, and the wind screamed past them, and Samuel's chest was heaving with cold air and effort, and he was grinning this sudden, completely unguarded grin that Nathan had never seen on him, that didn't look like a 14-year-old trying to be 22, that looked like a boy who had just done something he'd been wanting to prove he could do. Nathan looked at that grin. "Good work," he said. Samuel's grin went wider, and then he seemed to remember himself and pulled it back to something more controlled. But it was too late. Nathan had seen it. They rode back to the ranch in the full howl of the storm. When they came in through the back door, stomping cold off their boots, Elizabeth was in the kitchen with all 3 younger boys ranged around the table doing various tasks. Henry with a mechanical diagram he'd been working on. Thomas reading Benjamin. Asleep with his face against his arms on the table, and his father's hat still on his head. She took one look at Samuel's red face and the particular expression he was wearing, and then looked at Nathan. Nathan met her eyes and gave the smallest possible nod. She looked at her son. Samuel hung up his coat and said without looking at her, "I helped move the cattle." "I can see that," she said. "Nathan said I did good work." "I heard what Nathan said." A pause. "Are you angry?" Samuel asked. She turned back to the stove. "Ask me after I've had time to think about it." Samuel looked at Nathan, quick and uncertain. Nathan tilted his head toward the table in a gesture that said plainly, "Sit down and let her process it." Samuel sat down. By dinner, the promised stew on time at 6, because Elizabeth Carter kept her word on practical things, the way other people kept their word on important things, which Nathan was beginning to understand was the same thing to her. She had apparently finished thinking about it. "You did well today," she said to Samuel, setting his bowl down. He looked up at her. "But," she said. "I know," he said. "I should have told you I was going." "You should have told me and asked, not just told me after." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him for a moment. Then something in her face changed, went from careful to real, and she put her hand on top of his head briefly, the quick, unself-conscious gesture of a mother who has loved this particular head for 14 years, and she moved on to Benjamin's bowl. Samuel sat very still for a second after her hand left his hair. Then he picked up his spoon. Across the table, Nathan watched all of this and said nothing and ate his stew. The storm lasted 2 days. On the second day, when the worst of it had settled into a steady, heavy snowfall, and the ranch was locked down, and there was nothing to do but wait it out, Nathan found himself in the unusual situation of being inside his own house for an entire day, with no urgent task demanding his immediate attention. He sat at his table. He picked up the account books. He put them down. He looked at the main room where Henry was lying on his stomach on the floor, with the mechanical diagrams spread out in front of him. And Thomas was in the chair with the almanac, and Benjamin was running a wooden horse along the edge of the hearth, making a sound that was apparently the noise a horse made when it was having adventures. Elizabeth was mending in the chair by the window. Samuel had claimed the footstool and was sharpening a pocket knife with the concentration of someone trying to do something perfectly. Nathan sat at his table in the middle of all of this, and felt precisely, and without being able to do anything about it, that he was in his home. Not his house. His home. The difference between those two words was something he had stopped feeling 3 years ago, and it was coming back now. The way circulation comes back to a numbed limb with an ache, and not entirely comfortably, but undeniably. Benjamin abandoned the wooden horse and came to lean against Nathan's knee. He did this without asking. Without apparent thought, the way 4-year-olds move toward whatever was warm and solid and present. He put both forearms on Nathan's knee and leaned his chin on his arms and looked up at Nathan with the brown eyes he'd gotten from his father. "What are you thinking about?" Benjamin said. "Work," Nathan said. "What work?" "Ranch work." "Is the ranch okay?" "The ranch is fine." Benjamin considered this. "Is it gonna snow more?" "Probably. Henry says snow is frozen precipitation." Henry's right. Thomas says it's water that got cold. Thomas is also right. Benjamin thought about this philosophical convergence for a moment. "Can I have a cookie?" "There are cookies," Nathan said. "Mama made them this morning. She said they were for after dinner, but I think—" He adopted an expression of careful diplomacy. "I think she might make an exception." Nathan looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth looked at her mending. "No." Benjamin looked at Nathan with the expression of a man whose gambit has failed. "After dinner," Nathan said. Benjamin sighed with his entire body and went back to the wooden horse. Henry looked up from his diagram. "Benjamin." "What?" "Come look at this. I'll explain how the mechanism works." "I know how it works," Benjamin said. "You do not." "I do. It goes around and then it does the thing." Henry stared at him with the expression of an engineer confronting a person who has described architecture as the stuff that holds the ceiling up. "Come look at it properly." Benjamin went and looked at it properly. Across the Samuel's mouth twitched. Elizabeth looked up from her mending and found Nathan watching her, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the room full of their children. And Nathan thought about the letter from the Hartwell agency, folded in quarters on the edge of the kitchen table, and Elizabeth thought about something he couldn't read, and then she went back to her mending, and he went back to the account books. But neither of them was really looking at what they were supposed to be looking at. The storm broke on the third morning, and when it did, the world outside was white and clean and silent and very cold. And Nathan went out to check the damage with Walter and the hands, and it was significant but manageable, which in Wyoming winters was about as good as you could ask for. He came back at midday and found Elizabeth in the barn. She was standing at Charlie's stall, and Charlie had his nose over the gate, and she was talking to him in a low voice, the way people sometimes talk to animals when they needed to say something they weren't ready to say to a person. Nathan stood in the barn door and didn't announce himself. He heard her say, I know it's cold." She scratched the horse between the eyes in the particular spot Charlie liked, which Nathan had shown her about 5 days ago in passing, and which she had apparently filed away permanently. You're all right, old man." She heard Nathan come up behind her and didn't startle, which meant she'd heard him come in. "He favored the leg again this morning," she said without turning. "Cold," Nathan said, coming up to stand beside her. "He'll be all right when it warms." "I know," she said. "I was just—" She stopped. "Talking to him," Nathan said. "Talking to him," she agreed without embarrassment. They stood beside Charlie's stall for a moment, the horse's breath making small clouds in the cold air. "The letter," Nathan said. "Did you write back to the agency?" "The day I said I would," she said. "Good." She turned and looked at him. Not quite the way she usually looked at him, something different in it, something more searching. "Nathan, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "What would you have done if I'd said I was going to Denver?" The question arrived with a specific weight. The kind of question you only ask when you already know the answer matters more than you've let yourself admit. Nathan thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. "I would have packed up your bags and driven you to the station," he said. "And I would have wished you well." Her eyes didn't leave his face. "And after?" A pause. "And after would have been my problem," he said quietly. "Not yours." She held his gaze for a long moment. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I didn't stay because of Denver. I didn't stay because you're a good ranch or a safe option. I've had safe options before and they were—" She looked for the word. "They were safe, that's all. Elizabeth, I stayed because of Samuel's face in the morning since you told him he's staying." Her voice was steady, but something underneath it was not. "I stayed because Henry came downstairs yesterday and told me he thinks he knows how to fix the pump mechanism in the south pasture, and his eyes he looked like himself. Nathan. For the first time in 2 years, he looked like himself. I stayed because Thomas has read every chapter of that almanac and 3 of your other books, and he asked me last night if you'd ever let him go out with the cattle in the spring." Nathan was looking at her. "And Benjamin," she said and stopped. She stopped because her voice had done the thing it did when she was keeping something too big from getting through. "What about Benjamin?" Nathan said. She got control of herself. One breath. "Benjamin told me this morning," she said, "that he's decided you're a good man. He said he's been watching you to make sure." She paused. "He said you always give him the bread before he has to ask." Nathan's chest was doing something he didn't have good language for. "He's a perceptive kid," Nathan said, because it was true, and because he needed to say something. "He has his father's instincts for people," she said. "James always knew." She looked at the horse for a moment. "Those 4 boys are why I stayed. They're the reason for everything I do. They always have been." She turned back to him. "But I want you to know that they are not the only reason." The barn was very quiet. Nathan took 1 step closer to her. Just one, just enough. "I know," he said. It was a Nathan Cole answer, short and plain, and meaning considerably more than it said. She looked up at him. He was close enough that she had to look up. "We should go in," she said. "It's cold." "It is," he said. Neither of them moved for another moment. Then she turned toward the barn door, and he walked beside her, and their shoulders almost touched, and neither of them moved away. They were halfway to the house when Walter appeared from around the equipment shed, stopped dead when he saw them walking side by side with that particular shoulder-to-shoulder proximity, and then very deliberately turned around and walked the other direction whistling. Nathan watched him go. "Your foreman is transparent," Elizabeth said. "He is," Nathan agreed. "He's been hoping for this since we arrived, hasn't he?" "Since before we arrived, I suspect," Nathan said. "He's the one who pushed me to write to the agency." She looked at him sideways. "Remind me to thank him." They went inside. The house was warm and full of sound. Henry arguing cheerfully with Benjamin about the mechanical diagram. Thomas asking Samuel a question about something. The sounds of 4 boys and 1 household doing what households do when there are people in them who want to be there. Elizabeth went to the stove. Nathan hung his coat and sat at his table and looked at his account books and did not open them for a full 5 minutes because he was listening to his house. It was on the 14th day that the second letter arrived. Not from the marriage agency this time. This one came with a Cheyenne postmark and a name Nathan recognized immediately. Aldous Crane Esqueeler of the law firm Crane and Whitfield. One of 3 lawyers in Cheyenne, and the one with the specific reputation for doing careful, quiet, effective work on behalf of men with money who wanted things handled without drama. Nathan read the letter standing in the barn. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket and went to find Walter. You know a man named Gerald Whitmore, Nathan said. Walter thought. Denver businessman, made money in land speculation. Buys up homestead claims when settlers can't pay their taxes. What else? Older man, widower. Walter looked at Nathan's face. Why? He contacted a lawyer here, Nathan said. Crane. Walter went still. About what? Nathan pulled the letter out. He's making a formal inquiry into the legal status of the marriage arrangement between Elizabeth Carter and myself. He's asking Crane to investigate whether the placement through Hartwell Agency was properly documented and legally binding, and whether Mrs. Carter has the right to... He looked at the letter. Whether Mrs. Carter has the right to enter into a new arrangement without formal dissolution of the current one. A silence. He's saying you're not legally married, Walter said. We're not, Nathan said. Not yet. The agency arranged a placement. There's a formal agreement, but a legal ceremony hasn't taken place. And Whitmore knows this. Whitmore knows this, Nathan confirmed. And his lawyer is looking into whether the current arrangement can be challenged. Walter looked at him for a long moment. He wants Elizabeth. I wants a family, Nathan said, and something in his voice on that word was harder than anything Walter had heard from him in years. And he's got the money and the lawyer to make things complicated if he decides to. What are you going to do? Walter said. Nathan folded the letter and put it back in his pocket. First, he said, I'm going to talk to Elizabeth. And second, Nathan looked out at his ranch, his 400 acres, his cattle, his fences, the house where 5 other people were living their lives right now as if they were already supposed to be there. Second, he said, I'm going to pay a visit to Crane's office. Walter watched him. You're not going to tell me I'm overreacting, Nathan said. Not even a little, Walter said. Nathan went to the house. He found Elizabeth at the kitchen table, where else always at the kitchen table with her numbers and her lists, making the ranch work better than it had in years. Samuel was in the barn. The younger boys were upstairs. It was as close to a private moment as this house produced. He sat down across from her and set the letter on the table between them. She looked at it. She looked at him. She picked it up and read it. He watched her face as she read. She finished. She set the letter down. She pressed both hands flat on the table in front of her. The gesture he'd come to understand was her particular way of keeping herself anchored when something was trying to knock her sideways. He wrote to you, she said. His lawyer wrote to me, Nathan said, to find out whether there was a real arrangement here or just a paper one. Her jaw tightened slightly. Gerald Whitmore is a man who buys things, she said. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. He doesn't know how to want something he can't purchase, so he hires a lawyer to find the loophole. She looked at Nathan. He will make this very difficult. Let him try, Nathan said. She looked at him. Elizabeth, Nathan said. He said her name the way he said everything plain direct without performance. There is a straightforward way to make this letter irrelevant. She knew what he was saying. He watched her understand it. Nathan, she said carefully, I don't want you to do something because a letter arrived and you felt... I told Samuel 14 days ago you were staying, Nathan said. I told you 4 days ago. I'm telling you again now. The only thing that's changed is that somebody is trying to use a technicality to take you away from a place where you and your sons have already put down roots. He looked at her steadily. That's not why I'm asking. That's just why I'm asking now instead of waiting any longer. She held his gaze. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside. Benjamin's voice drifted through the ceiling from upstairs, saying something to Henry in the serious carrying tone he used when he had an important opinion to share. Elizabeth looked at the ceiling for a moment, listening to her son's voice, and something in her face went from carefully controlled to simply true. She looked at Nathan. All right, she said. All right, he said. He put his hand on the table between them, not reaching for hers, just putting it there. And she put her hand next to his. And they sat at the kitchen table in the late afternoon light with their hands almost touching, and the letter from Aldous Crane SQ. Between them, and neither of them looked away. Outside, the Cole ranch went on doing what it always had: cattle and fences and cold ground and hard work, and the ordinary business of survival. But something inside the house had just become permanent. And Gerald Whitmore's lawyer was about to discover what happened when a man who had spent 3 years with nothing left to lose suddenly found something worth fighting for. Nathan rode into Cheyenne the next morning before the sun was fully up. He didn't tell Elizabeth where he was going. He told her he had business in town, which was true, and he told Walter he'd be back by noon, and he saddled his horse in the cold dark and rode the 12 miles to Cheyenne with the letter from Aldous Crane Esq. folded in his breast pocket, and a very specific kind of quiet in his chest, the quiet of a man who has made a decision and is now simply executing it. The offices of Crane and Whitfield were on the second floor above the Cheyenne Merchant Bank, and Aldous Crane was already at his desk when Nathan arrived, which told Nathan that Crane was the kind of lawyer who worked early hours because he had enough clients with enough complications to need them. Crane was 60, something thin, with the careful eyes of a man whose profession required him to see several sides of every situation simultaneously. He stood when Nathan came in and offered his hand and said, "Mr. Cole, I expected I'd be hearing from you." "Then you knew what you were doing when you wrote that letter," Nathan said. "I always know what I'm doing," Crane said pleasantly. "Sit down." Nathan sat. Crane sat across from him and folded his hands on his desk. "My client, Mr. Whitmore, has a genuine interest in formalizing an arrangement with Mrs. Carter and her sons. He believes the current situation at your ranch is," he chose his word carefully, "irregular. The situation at my ranch," Nathan said, "is that a woman and her 4 sons arrived on December the 4th and have been there since, and I intend for them to remain there permanently." "As what?" Crane said. "As my family," Nathan said. "We intend to marry." Crane nodded slowly, making a small note. "When?" "As soon as it can be arranged." "Mr. Cole." Crane set his pen down. "You understand that my client is a man of considerable resources. He has—" "I know what he has," Nathan said. "I know what he does. He buys homestead claims when settlers can't make their taxes. He employs lawyers to find technicalities. I reckon he's very good at all of that." Nathan leaned forward slightly in his chair. "But Mrs. Carter is not a homestead claim, and she's not for purchase, and any technicality your client thinks he's found in the arrangement documentation is going to disappear the moment she and I stand in front of a minister, which we will be doing shortly." Crane studied him. "Mr. Whitmore may pursue other avenues," Crane said carefully. "He is a persistent man." "So am I," Nathan said. "And I have the advantage of already being in Wyoming." A silence. Crane picked up his pen again. "I'll convey your position to my client." "You do that," Nathan said. He stood. "And Mr. Crane, you seem like a man who knows when a case has merit and when it doesn't. I'd encourage you to think carefully about which kind this is before you let your client spend money chasing something that's already done." Crane looked at him for a long moment. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," he said. "Morning," Nathan said, and put his hat on and left. He rode back to the ranch with something different in him than what he'd ridden in with. Not relief exactly. More like the feeling of a door that had been standing open in a cold wind finally being shut and latched. He got back before noon. Elizabeth was in the kitchen. She looked at his face when he came in, the way she always looked at his face, taking a quick inventory, reading the details, and then she said without preamble, "You went to see Crane." "I did," Nathan said. And I told him we were marrying," Nathan said, shortly. She went still for just a moment. Then she said, "Did you tell me before you told the lawyer this time or after?" Nathan thought about this. The answer was after. He had in fact told the lawyer before he'd formally told Elizabeth, in the sense that he'd stated their intention to the lawyer based on what she'd said the evening before. All right, which was Elizabeth Carter. For yes, but which was not strictly speaking a formal conversation. "That's fair," he said. She looked at him with the expression that lived somewhere between exasperation and something warmer. "Nathan." "I know," he said. "You can't just—" "I know," he said again. "I handled it in the wrong order. I wanted to deal with Crane before he had time to file anything on Whitmore's behalf." "That's practical," she said. "It is. It's also—" She stopped, looked at her hands, then looked at him. "Ask me properly. Not because of Crane, and not because of Whitmore, and not for any practical reason. Ask me the way a person asks." Nathan took his hat off. He held it in both hands, standing in his kitchen, in his good coat that he'd worn to Cheyenne because he'd wanted to look like a man who meant business. And he looked at Elizabeth Carter across the kitchen table, where she'd reorganized his life for 3 weeks running, and fixed his accounts, and fed his men, and talked to his horse, and raised 4 boys into people he'd be proud to claim. "Elizabeth," he said, "will you marry me?" It wasn't quite a question. It came out in the same register he used for everything flat and certain and genuine, and somehow that made it more, not less. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. Just that. Just yes in the same plain register, because they were 2 people who communicated in plain things and meant every one of them. Nathan put his hat back on. "I'll arrange for the minister," he said. "I'll need a day to alter my dress," she said. "How long?" "1 day." "All right," he said. He went back out to the ranch. She went back to her numbers. And in the kitchen, where nobody was watching and nothing dramatic was happening, a thing that had been becoming true for 3 weeks was now simply true. What neither of them knew was that Gerald Whitmore was not a man who accepted a lawyer's report and moved on. The second letter arrived the following morning. Not to the ranch this time, but to the Hartwell Marriage Agency in St. Louis, with a copy sent to the Territorial Administrator's office in Cheyenne. It was a formal challenge to the agency placement documentation, claiming procedural irregularities in the arrangement between Mrs. Elizabeth Carter and Mr. Nathan Cole, and requesting a 30-day review period before any legal proceedings such as marriage could be formalized. Walter brought the news from town, where he'd heard it from a man who worked at the administrator's office, and had the particular habits of men in small offices in territorial capitals, which included talking about interesting documents to anyone they knew. Nathan read the summary Walter relayed. He set his coffee cup down. 30 days, he said. "That's what Whitmore's asking for," Walter said. "Whether the administrator grants it is another question, but if he does, it ties our hands long enough for Whitmore to make his case to Elizabeth directly," Nathan said. "With resources and a lawyer and 30 days to work on her." "That'd be my read," Walter said. Nathan was quiet for a moment. "He hasn't met Elizabeth," Nathan said. "No," Walter said. "If he had, he wouldn't bother with the 30 days. Walter allowed himself a small smile. "No, I reckon he wouldn't. But the situation was real, and the administrator was real, and Crane was real, and Nathan was not a man who dealt in wishful thinking. He went back inside and found Elizabeth already reading a letter of her own. A copy of Whitmore's filing had been sent directly to her as well, which told Nathan that Whitmore wanted her to know he was fighting, that he wanted her to feel the pressure and make a calculation. She read it with her hands flat on the table. When she finished, she looked at Nathan and said in a voice that was entirely steady, "He sent one to me as well." "I heard," Nathan said. "He's asking me to consider my position." She turned the letter over face down with a precision that was its own kind of statement. "He says he can provide stability and security for myself and my sons. He says—" She paused. "He says a working ranch in Wyoming is no place for 4 growing boys." Nathan's jaw tightened. "He doesn't know your boys," he said. "No," she said. "He doesn't." She looked at Nathan. He's trying to frighten me. He thinks I'm the kind of woman who can be managed by fear." "Are you?" "What do you think?" she said with a look that answered the question entirely. Nathan almost smiled. "The administrator's review," he said. "If it's granted, we wait 30 days. We don't have to like it. But we wait, and we get married the day it's done, and Whitmore has nothing left to stand on. And if he tries something else in those 30 days, she said. "Then we deal with it," Nathan said. She looked at him steadily. "Together." "Together," he said. She picked up the letter and folded it and set it at the far edge of the table, same spot she'd put the first letter from the agency, the one she'd declined. She had a particular geography for unwanted correspondence Nathan had noticed. She didn't throw things away. She just moved them to the edge. The administrator granted a 15-day review. Not 3015. It was in the geography of Wyoming Territorial Administration. A compromise that left everyone somewhat dissatisfied, which Walter said was generally how you knew a territorial administrator was doing his job. 15 days. Nathan went back to work. It was on the third day of the review period that Samuel found out. Nathan had not told the boys anything about Whitmore or the legal challenge, and Elizabeth hadn't either. There was an unspoken agreement between them that the children would not be put in the position of worrying about something the adults were handling. But Samuel was 14 and perceptive, and had a habit of listening to adult conversations from the right kind of distance. And the evening after the review was granted, he appeared at the barn where Nathan was working late, and stood in the doorway with his hands in his coat pockets and his jaw set in the particular way it set when he was about to say something difficult. "Someone's trying to take us away," Samuel said. Nathan didn't stop what he was doing immediately. He finished the task in his hands. He was adjusting a buckle on a harness, and then he set it down and looked at Samuel. "Where'd you hear that?" Nathan said. "Pieces," Samuel said. "I'm good at putting pieces together." Nathan considered lying to him. He dismissed the idea. Samuel was 14 and had been figuring out adult situations since he was 12, and lying to him would be both unsuccessful and disrespectful. "A man named Whitmore," Nathan said. "From Denver. He made a claim against our arrangement with the agency. There's a legal review." "Can he take us?" Samuel said. The words were flat and specific, and the steadiness of them cost him something. Nathan could see it in the set of his shoulders. "No," Nathan said. "How do you know?" "Because your mother and I are getting married the day the review is done, and after that there's nothing he can do." Samuel looked at him. "And if something goes wrong with the review?" Samuel. "If something goes wrong," Samuel pressed. Not panic. Just this 14-year-old who had learned that adults said things would be fine, and sometimes things were not fine, and who needed to know the actual answer. Nathan crossed the barn and stood in front of him. "Look at me," Nathan said. Samuel looked at him. "I am not going to let anyone take you or your brothers or your mother away from this ranch," Nathan said. He said it the way he'd said you're staying with the plain certainty of a man who has made a decision and does not revisit it. Not Whitmore, not a lawyer, not a review, not anything. Do you understand me? Samuel's jaw worked for a moment. "You can't promise that," Samuel said. "You can't promise legal things." "No," Nathan admitted. "I can't promise what a lawyer does, but I can promise what I do. And what I'm going to do is make sure this family doesn't go anywhere." He paused. "That's enough of a promise for now." Samuel was quiet. He looked at his boots, then at Nathan, then away. "My father used to say things would be fine," Samuel said very quietly. He said it right up until he couldn't say anything anymore. The barn was very still. Nathan didn't flinch from it, didn't look away from the pain in that sentence or rush to put something comfortable over it. "I know," he said, "and I'm not telling you things will be fine. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. There's a difference." Samuel looked at him. Something in the boy's face, that 2-year-old weight he'd been carrying, the one that had made him square his shoulders on a train platform and stand in front of his brothers and try to be enough for all of them, shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. "Okay," Samuel said. "Okay," Nathan said. Samuel turned to go. "Samuel," Nathan said. He turned back. "You did good thinking things through and coming to ask me directly. That's the right way to handle it." Samuel nodded once carefully, the way he received compliments, like something he was not entirely sure what to do with, but intended to figure out. He went back to the house. Nathan stood in the barn for a while after. He was thinking about Samuel's father, and about a boy of 12 who had been there at the end of something, and about how that boy had walked onto a train platform in Cheyenne with his shoulders squared and stood in front of his brothers like a wall. I was thinking about how much weight a child could carry before it changed the shape of him. And he was thinking with a clarity that surprised him with its force that one of the things he was going to do with whatever time he had on this earth was make sure Samuel Carter no longer had to carry that much. He wasn't ready to say that out loud yet, but he was going to do it. On the 7th day of the review period, Gerald Whitmore came to Cheyenne. Nathan found out from Walter, who found out from the man at the administrator's office, who found out because Whitmore had checked into the Grand Central Hotel and made no particular secret of his presence. He was accompanied by Crane and a second lawyer Nathan didn't recognize, and a personal secretary, and he had apparently taken a suite on the second floor and sent a note to the administrator's office requesting a meeting at the earliest convenience. Nathan listened to this report over coffee at the kitchen table, while Elizabeth sat across from him going through her own work with the particular stillness she wore when she was thinking hard about something. When Walter finished and left the kitchen, Elizabeth said, "He came himself." "He did," Nathan said. "He wouldn't have come himself unless he thought there was something here worth coming for," she said. "He thinks he can appeal to you directly," Nathan said. "Without the letter, without the lawyer, in person." She looked at her papers. "And can he?" "Elizabeth." "I know," she said quickly. "I know. I'm not considering it. I just—" She pressed her fingers against her forehead for a moment. "I want to understand what he thinks he's doing." "He thinks he's making a better offer," Nathan said. "He thinks you're a practical woman who can be persuaded by a better offer." "I am a practical woman," she said. "You are," Nathan said. "But you're also a woman who knows the difference between a better offer and the right place." She looked at him. That look, the one he was still learning all the dimensions of, the one that lived somewhere between appreciation and something much more guarded, something she'd been protecting for a very long time. "Will he try to contact me directly?" she said. "Probably," Nathan said. "I'd like to be there when he does." "I don't need you to fight my battles," she said with the mild precision of a woman who has been fighting them herself for long enough to have opinions about it. "I know," Nathan said. "I'd like to be there anyway." She considered this. "Why?" "Because you're not alone in this," he said. "And I want you to see that." A pause. "All right," she said. Same word she'd used when he asked her to marry him. Same register. Whitmore's note arrived at the ranch on the 8th day. It was addressed to Mrs. Elizabeth Carter, not to Nathan, just to Elizabeth, which was its own statement, and it was written in the smooth, confident hand of a man who had dictated many letters and knew exactly what words to choose. It expressed his sincere hope that Mrs. Carter would honor him with a brief meeting at her convenience to discuss matters of mutual interest. It mentioned in the 3rd paragraph that he had given considerable thought to the welfare of her sons and had some ideas he believed she would find compelling. It was, Nathan thought, when Elizabeth showed it to him, a very well-written letter that managed to say, "I have more money than this rancher," in 12 lines without using any of those words. "He's good," Nathan said. "He's practiced," Elizabeth said. "Are you going to meet with him?" She folded the letter. "Yes." Nathan looked at her. "If I don't," she said, "he'll keep finding other avenues. He'll file more things. He'll make it drag on. If I meet with him and make my position clear directly, he'll understand that there's nothing here for him and he can go back to Denver. And if he doesn't understand that, then we'll know we tried the direct way and we can proceed accordingly." Nathan thought about this. "I'm coming," he said. "I thought you might say that," she said. They met Whitmore at the Grand Central Hotel on the 9th day of the review period in the small private dining room off the lobby that the hotel kept for business meetings. Nathan had been in this room twice before, both times for cattle buying negotiations, and he understood its function. It was a place designed to make serious things feel civil. Gerald Whitmore was older than Nathan had imagined, not 51, which was what the agency letter had said, but 51 in the way of a man who had spent those 51 years in comfort and was therefore better preserved than the number suggested. He was broad-shouldered and well-dressed and had the practiced warmth of someone who had succeeded in enough business dealings to know how to make the person across the table feel respected and considered, while he was also getting exactly what he wanted. He stood when Elizabeth came in, which was the right gesture, and he extended his hand to Nathan, which was also the right gesture. He was, Nathan noted, doing everything right. That was the most dangerous kind of opponent. "Mrs. Carter," Whitmore said. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Cole." He nodded. "Please sit." They sat. Coffee was brought. Nathan didn't touch his. "I want to be direct," Whitmore said, which was what people said when they intended to be persuasive rather than direct. "I understand you've both made certain plans, and I respect that. I've spent my life respecting decisive people." He looked at Elizabeth. "But I wonder if I might share some thoughts as a man who has your son's futures genuinely in mind." "My son's futures are not something I need another man to manage," Elizabeth said pleasantly. Whitmore absorbed this without flinching, which meant he'd expected it. "Of course. But Mrs. Carter, Wyoming is—" He paused carefully. "This is a hard land, a cattle ranch in a hard land. I've looked into the coal operation. It's respectable. It's working." He nodded toward Nathan, acknowledging something. "But 4 growing boys need opportunities. Education. Prospects. In Denver, I can offer your son schooling at the Harrison Academy. I have connections with 2 territorial banks and a railway company. When your boys are old enough—" "Mr. Whitmore," Elizabeth said. He stopped. "My son Henry," she said, "repaired a piece of farm equipment last week that Nathan and his foreman hadn't been able to correctly diagnose in 2 months. He's 11. My son Thomas has read every agricultural reference book on this ranch and is already thinking about spring cattle management. My son Samuel works this land every morning before breakfast. And my son Benjamin—" She paused. "My son Benjamin has decided Nathan is a good man, and he made that decision on evidence, and Benjamin does not change his mind." Whitmore looked at her. "What my sons need," Elizabeth said, "is exactly where they are. Not a school in Denver, not railway connections, not your version of their future." She held his gaze with complete steadiness. "Their future is being built right now, on that ranch, with that man." She did not gesture toward Nathan. She didn't need to. "And that's not something I'm interested in negotiating." A silence. Whitmore looked at Nathan. Nathan looked back at him and said nothing, because Elizabeth had said everything, and he was not going to reduce it by adding to it. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his coffee. He looked at his hands. He looked at the wall between them. Then he said quietly, "She won't change her mind, will she?" It was directed at Nathan. "No," Nathan said. "She won't." Whitmore nodded slowly. "The review," Whitmore said. "I'll instruct Crane to withdraw the filing." Elizabeth's hands, which had been very still on the table, moved slightly. "Today," Nathan said. "Today," Whitmore said. He sounded tired, not defeated, exactly, more like a man who had run a calculation and found the result wasn't what he'd hoped for. "I'm not in the habit of pursuing situations where the outcome is already determined." He looked at Elizabeth one more time. "Your boys are fortunate, Mrs. Carter. In more ways than I think you fully realize." Elizabeth looked at him. "I realize completely," she said. They left the hotel. On the street, Elizabeth walked beside Nathan in the cold December air, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and then she let out a long breath that had probably been in her chest since the 9th day of the review started. "He withdrew it," she said. "He did," Nathan said. "It's done." "It's done," he said. She stopped walking. Nathan stopped beside her. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not the careful, controlled look. Not the working through something look. Not even the warm one she saved for the boys. Something that had been holding itself very carefully for a very long time and had just discovered it didn't have to hold anymore. "Nathan," she said. "Yeah," he said. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She put her hand through the crook of his arm the first time she'd done anything like it. This small gesture of belonging, and they walked back toward where the wagon was. The minister was available on Saturday. Nathan told Walter that afternoon. Walter took off his hat, pressed it to his chest, and said, "Thank the Lord," with such sincere relief that Nathan looked at him. "You've been worried," Nathan said. "I've been worried since December 4th, Walter said. "Yes." Nathan shook his head and went to check the fence. On Friday evening, the night before the wedding, Nathan was in the kitchen with his account books that he wasn't really looking at, and Samuel came downstairs and sat across from him. He sat there for a while. Nathan let him sit. "Can I ask you something?" Samuel said finally. "Go ahead." Samuel was quiet for another moment, turning something over. "My father," he said. "James Carter. He was a good man. He loved my mother. He loved us." His voice was even. "I'm not going to pretend he was something different than he was just because things went wrong." "Nobody's asking you to," Nathan said. "I know," Samuel said. "I just—" He looked at the table. "I want to know if you understand that. That you're not replacing him. That he was real and he matters, and we're not going to forget him because—" "Samuel." Nathan said it quietly but directly. "I know that." "You do." "I know his hat belongs to Benjamin," Nathan said. "I know Henry writes things down so he doesn't forget. I know Thomas got his love of books from your mother, but his way of going quiet when he's thinking from your father. I know you have his steadiness and his instincts for people, even when they tell you things you don't want to hear." Samuel was staring at him. "How do you know that?" Samuel said. "About Thomas and the books and—" "I pay attention," Nathan said simply. A silence. "I'm not here to replace him," Nathan said. "I couldn't, and I wouldn't. He was your father, and he's always going to be your father." He paused. "But I'm here, and I intend to stay here. And I'd like it if that meant something to you, even if it means something different than what your father meant. It doesn't have to be the same thing to be a real thing." Samuel looked at the table for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were dry, but something in his face was wide open, in a way Nathan had only glimpsed once before in the barn, the morning Nathan told him he was staying. "Okay," Samuel said. "Okay," Nathan said. Samuel stood up. He pushed his chair back, in which was something Elizabeth had instilled in all four of them, and he went to the door of the kitchen. He stopped. "Nathan," he said without turning around. "Yeah, I'm glad it was you," Samuel said. "On the platform. I'm glad it was you who picked up the bag." Nathan sat at his kitchen table and looked at the place where Samuel had been sitting and felt something move through him that he did not have a name for and did not need one. He sat there for a while after Samuel went upstairs. The fire burned low. Outside the coal ranch was quiet, in the way it was quiet now, the quiet of a place that had people in it, breath in every room, the particular aliveness of a house that had become a home. Tomorrow was Saturday. And Nathan Cole, who had spent 3 years learning to live without anything that mattered, sat alone in his kitchen for the last night he would spend alone in it, and found he was not afraid. He was ready. Saturday came the way Wyoming mornings always came, fast and cold and without ceremony. Nathan was up before dawn. He dressed in the dark the way he always did, except that this morning he reached past his working clothes and took down the good suit that had hung in the back of his wardrobe since Clara's funeral 3 years ago. He had not worn it since. He had not been sure he ever would again. He put it on. It still fit. He stood in the dark bedroom for a moment with his hand on the wardrobe door. He thought about Clara, not with the heavy, breathless grief that had lived in his chest for 3 years, but with something quieter. Something that felt for the first time like genuine memory rather than open wound. He thought about 9 years and a boy they lost, and a woman who had loved this ranch almost as much as he had. He thought about what she would have said watching him stand in the dark in his good suit on a Saturday morning. She would have told him to comb his hair. He combed his hair. He went downstairs. Elizabeth was already in the kitchen. She was wearing a dress he hadn't seen before, deep green altered from something older. He could tell by the seam lines, but done so carefully that it looked entirely intentional. Her hair was up differently than usual, more formal, and she was standing at the stove with her back to him, doing something that turned out to be making coffee, because Elizabeth Carter started every significant moment of her life with something practical. She heard him come in and turned. They looked at each other across the kitchen. "You combed your hair," she said. "You fixed the dress," he said. "3 nights ago," she said, after everyone was asleep. He crossed to the table and sat down, and she brought him coffee without being asked, because she had learned exactly how he took it. And she sat across from him, and for a moment they just sat in the kitchen that had started as his and become theirs, with the coffee between them and the house quiet around them. "How are you?" he asked. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "Ready," she said. Not nervous. Nervous and ready aren't mutually exclusive, she said. No, he agreed. They're not. She looked at her coffee cup. Nathan, before the boys come down, I want to say something. Go ahead. She looked up at him. I know why you picked up the bag at the station. I know you told yourself it was practical, that you were cold, that you hadn't decided anything. He waited. You had decided, she said. You just didn't know it yet. He held her gaze. Maybe, he said. Not maybe, she said quietly. A man who hadn't decided anything would have sent the telegram the night before. You chose not to. Everything after that was just catching up to the choice you'd already made. Nathan sat with this for a moment. You've been thinking about that for a while, he said. Since about the third day, she said. He almost smiled. Why didn't you say it then? Because you needed to figure it out yourself, she said. Some people do. He looked at her, this woman who had reorganized his accounts and fixed his broken systems and talked to his horse and raised 4 boys into people he would choose, and who had apparently also at some point during the third day understood him more completely than he'd understood himself. Elizabeth, he said. Yes. I'm glad you couldn't sleep that first night, he said. I'm glad you got up and fixed the billing records. Something moved across her face, that rare thing, the fully open look. So am I, she said. They heard Benjamin's feet hit the floor upstairs. Then the particular scramble that meant he'd remembered something important and was moving with purpose. They had approximately 45 seconds before the kitchen was no longer theirs alone. Nathan reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his. 45 seconds. It was enough. Benjamin arrived in the kitchen doorway wearing his nightshirt and his father's hat, which had somehow become part of his standard dress regardless of occasion, and stopped when he saw them at the table. He looked at their hands. He looked at Nathan's suit. He looked at Elizabeth's green dress. Are you getting married today? He said. Yes, Elizabeth said. Benjamin considered this with the gravity it deserved. Do I have to wear my good shirt? Yes, Elizabeth said. Benjamin sighed with everything he had. Then he said, Will there be food after? Yes, Nathan said. Benjamin's entire demeanor shifted. Okay, he said, and went back upstairs to find his good shirt, his priorities entirely resolved. Nathan and Elizabeth looked at each other. This time Nathan did smile, and it was a full one, the kind his face had forgotten how to make for 3 years and was apparently relearning. And Elizabeth smiled back with the particular warmth she saved for moments when nobody was performing anything for anyone. The other boys came down in stages. Henry first, already fully dressed, including the bent spectacles which he'd apparently taken to straightening against his nose as a nervous habit. Thomas with his book, which Elizabeth gently removed from his hands and set on the side table. Samuel last in his good shirt with his hair combed. Elizabeth's handiwork, Nathan suspected, applied while Samuel was still waking up looking older than 14, and also somehow younger. Walter knocked at the kitchen door at 8. He was wearing a suit Nathan had never seen before, which suggested he had purchased it specifically for this occasion, which suggested Walter had been planning for this moment considerably longer than Nathan had been. Morning, Walter said with elaborate casualness. You bought a suit, Nathan said. I've had this suit for years, Walter said. Walter. Walter looked at his hat. I bought it last week. It's a good suit. Dottie, Walter's wife, was with him, a comfortable, warm-faced woman who took one look at Elizabeth and said, "Oh, my dear," in a voice that meant she approved entirely, and then promptly took over the kitchen in the way that Dottie took over every kitchen she entered, which was with complete authority and zero apology. The minister, Reverend Parks, arrived at 10. How was a spare, kind man who had married and buried half of Cheyenne County and had the specific patience of someone who had presided over many significant moments and knew that what people needed from him in those moments was steadiness. He greeted Nathan with a handshake and Elizabeth with a slight bow and looked at the 4 boys arranged in various attitudes of formal attention near the fireplace. Benjamin with his father's hat held in both hands like something precious. Henry with his hands clasped behind his back. Thomas at attention with his chin up. Samuel standing slightly apart, with his arms at his sides and his jaw steady, and said, "Fine boys, Mrs. Carter." "They are," Elizabeth said. "They will be," Reverend Parks said, with a specific warmth that meant he was looking at the whole picture Cole boys by tonight. The room went very quiet. All four boys processed this in different ways. Thomas blinked. Henry pushed his spectacles up. Benjamin looked at his hat. Samuel looked at Nathan. Nathan looked back at him. Samuel gave him the smallest nod. They stood in the main room of the Cole Ranch. Nathan and Elizabeth in front of the fireplace. The boys and Walter and Dottie arranged around them, and Reverend Parks opened his book and began. The ceremony was not long. It was not elaborate. It was two people who communicated in plain things, saying plain things to each other in front of the people who mattered. When Parks reached the vows and asked Nathan if he would take Elizabeth Carter as his wife, the full formal construction to have and to hold, to love and to cherish, Nathan said, "I do," in exactly the same voice he used for everything. Flat, certain, like a man stating a fact he has no intention of ever revising. When Parks asked Elizabeth, she turned and looked at Nathan directly, and she said, "I do," with her gray eyes clear and her chin level. And it sounded like a conclusion and a beginning at exactly the same time. Parks said, "You may." Nathan did not wait for the rest of the sentence. He kissed her brief, certain the same register as everything else, and Elizabeth made a small sound that might have been surprise, or might have been relief, or might have been both. Dottie made a sound of unambiguous approval. Walter cleared his throat. Benjamin said, "Does that mean it's done?" "That means it's done," Samuel said quietly. "Good," Benjamin said, and put his father's hat back on his head. "Can we eat now?" Nathan pulled back and looked at Elizabeth, who was looking at him with that open expression, and he thought about December 4th, and a train platform, and one small suitcase, and a boy in a too large hat, and he thought about the telegram he hadn't sent. The best decision of his life had been the one he didn't make. Dottie had brought food. Of course. Dottie had brought food. Dottie had been feeding people through significant events for 30 years and was not going to stop now. And there was a table laid out in the kitchen with more food than 10 people could reasonably eat, which in Dottie's estimation was the right amount for a celebration. Benjamin ate with the focused dedication of a 4-year-old who had been promised food and intended to honor that promise fully. Thomas asked Reverend Parks 4 questions about the history of marriage ceremonies in Wyoming Territory, which Parks answered with remarkable patience. Henry showed Walter the mechanical diagram he'd been working on, and Walter, who had no particular mechanical aptitude, but had the wisdom to listen carefully to people who did examine it with complete seriousness. Samuel stayed near Nathan, not crowding him, not obviously, just near. The way he'd started standing in the barn close enough to be part of what was happening, but giving it room. Nathan noticed and said nothing, and simply let him be there, which was the right thing to do. At some point in the middle of the meal, when everyone was occupied and the kitchen was full of sound, Samuel said low enough that only Nathan could hear, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead," Nathan said. "The locked room," Samuel said. "On the 2nd floor, across from Henry and Thomas. You always lock it." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "It was Clara's room," he said. "Her sitting room." "Okay," Samuel said. He paused. "I'm not trying to... I didn't mean to bring up something." "It's all right," Nathan said. "Do you ever go in it?" "Not since she died," Nathan said. Samuel was quiet, turning something over. "Maybe," he said carefully. "That's something you could change. Not to forget her. Just..." He stopped. "Thomas said something last week. He said the saddest kind of forgetting is forgetting on purpose. Deciding something doesn't fit anymore and putting it away." He looked at Nathan sideways. "That room's not empty because Clara's gone. It's empty because you decided it should stay that way." Nathan looked at his 14-year-old stepson. He had picked up that boy's bag on a freezing train platform because it was cold and he hadn't decided anything. And now that boy was standing in his kitchen on his wedding day, giving him the clearest and most uncomfortable piece of wisdom he'd received in 3 years. "Yeah," Nathan said. "You're right." Samuel looked away. "Sorry, it's your business." "No," Nathan said. "You're right. I needed to hear it." Samuel nodded once carefully. After everyone had eaten, and Walter and Dottie had said their goodbyes, Dottie embracing Elizabeth for a long time, Walter shaking Nathan's hand and gripping it hard and saying only, "Good man," in a voice that meant about 14 other things, and Reverend Parks had taken his leave with Benjamin's hat nearly in his face twice during the farewell, the house settled back into itself. The boys went upstairs. The kitchen was cleared. The afternoon was quiet. Nathan went to the second floor. He stood in front of the locked room. He took the key from his pocket. He had carried it every day for 3 years, every single day, as though keeping it on his person meant he was still honoring something. He unlocked the door. He pushed it open. The room was dusty. It had Clara's chair in it, the blue one she had brought from her family's house when they married, and her writing desk, and the small bookshelf with the novels she'd loved, and a few things arranged on the top shelf that were hers particular to her, the small evidence of a specific person. He stood in the doorway. He didn't go in. Not yet. He just looked at it. Elizabeth came up the stairs and saw him standing there. She stopped. She looked at the open door. She looked at Nathan. "Her room," she said softly. "Her sitting room," he said. She came to stand beside him, not touching, just beside, and she looked into the room. "She had good taste," Elizabeth said. "That chair is beautiful." "She carried it in a wagon from Missouri," Nathan said. "Said she wasn't leaving it behind." Elizabeth looked at the chair for a moment. "That's the kind of woman she was." "Exactly the kind," Nathan said. "A quiet." "The shelf," Elizabeth said. "What's on it?" "Her things," Nathan said. "Her mother's brooch, a photograph, the book she was reading when she—" He stopped. "The book she had with her at the end." Elizabeth was very still beside him. "Nathan," she said, "I'm not going to ask you to take those down." He looked at her. "This was her home," Elizabeth said. "She built it with you, and she's not here, and that is a terrible and permanent thing, and nothing about us." She paused. "Nothing about us changes that. She was here first and she mattered, and her things should stay on that shelf." He looked at her for a long time. "I thought," he said, "that moving forward meant leaving it behind." "I know," she said. "Most people think that." She turned to look at him. "They're wrong. Moving forward means carrying it with you differently. Not putting it down. Just learning to carry it so it doesn't stop you from picking up anything else." Nathan thought about Benjamin and the hat. He thought about Henry, who wrote things down. He thought about Thomas, who had his father's way of going quiet. He thought about Samuel, who had his father's instincts and had never once pretended he didn't. This family he had acquired entirely by accident on a freezing December morning. They all knew how to do exactly what Elizabeth was describing. They had been doing it for 2 years, all 4 of them carrying someone they'd lost in the specific ways that fit who they were. They'd been showing him how all along. He hadn't been ready to see it until now. He reached into the room and pulled the door open fully. "Help me air it out," he said. "It should be a room people can come into." Elizabeth's hand found his arm. She didn't say anything. She went past him into the room and opened the window, and the cold December air came in and moved through the dust, and Nathan stepped over the threshold for the first time in 3 years and stood in Clara's sitting room with his wife and breathed. It hurt. Of course it hurt. But it was the hurt of something healing, not something tearing. There was a difference. That evening, the 6 of them sat together at the long kitchen table for the first time as something that had a real name. Benjamin had at some point migrated into Nathan's chair, realized what he'd done, looked at Nathan with wide eyes, and then decided that Nathan did not appear to be requiring his chair back and remained where he was. Nathan pulled up the spare chair without comment. Henry had brought the mechanical diagram to the table, which Elizabeth had said nothing about, because it was a special occasion, and Henry's way of celebrating things was to share what he was working on, and she understood this about her son. Thomas had retrieved the almanac, which Nathan had said nothing about for the same reason. Samuel was quiet but present, passing food without being asked, and refilling water glasses, and generally conducting himself in the manner of someone who has decided that taking care of the people around him is not a burden but a choice, and who is learning slowly that those two things are entirely different. At some point, after the plates were cleared, and the table was just people sitting around it, Benjamin looked at Nathan with the enormous seriousness he brought to every important question and said, "What do I call you?" The table went quiet. Elizabeth looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Benjamin. Henry pushed his spectacles up. Thomas held his book very still. Samuel across the table was looking at Nathan with that open, watchful expression. "What do you want to call me?" Nathan said. Benjamin thought about this with his whole face. The hat tilted sideways over one eye, one hand flat on the table. "Not Papa," he said. "Papa is Papa." "Okay," Nathan said. "But not just Nathan," Benjamin said. "That's what Mama calls you." "That's right." Benjamin thought some more. "Can I call you Pa?" he said. "It's different from Papa. It's like it's the same thing but different. So it's mine." The kitchen was so quiet, Nathan could hear the fire. He looked at this 4-year-old with his father's hat, and his mother's eyes, and the wooden horse on the kitchen floor, and the absolute uncomplicated honesty of a child who calls things what they are. "Yeah," Nathan said. "You can call me Pa." Benjamin nodded, satisfied the way he was satisfied when he confirmed the eggs were ready or the stew was done. Matter settled. On to the next thing. "Pa," he said, testing it once. "Yeah," Nathan said. "Can I have a cookie?" Elizabeth put a cookie on his plate before he finished the sentence. Henry looked at Samuel over the table. Samuel looked at Henry. Henry said very quietly, almost just to himself, "Pa." Nathan heard it. He did not make it into a moment. He did not look up or make a face or say anything because Henry was 11 in private and had chosen to try the word out in the way a careful person tries something out quietly, without audience, to see how it felt in his own mouth. Nathan just reached across and put another piece of bread on Henry's plate. Henry looked at it. He picked it up. He didn't say anything else, but he sat differently after that. Something in him slightly more settled, like a thing that had been not quite level finding its balance. Thomas, who missed nothing, looked between his brother and Nathan and opened his mouth. Samuel caught his eye and shook his head once. Thomas closed his mouth. He understood. Some things didn't need to be examined out loud to be real. After dinner, after the boys were upstairs, after the house had gone to that particular quiet that Nathan had spent 3 years calling loneliness, and now understood was just nighttime with more people in it. He sat at his kitchen table. Not with the account books. Just sat. Elizabeth came back downstairs. He hadn't heard her go up, but she'd apparently gone to check on the boys, and she sat across from him. "Benjamin's asleep," she said. "He fell asleep before I finished the first sentence." "Long day," Nathan said. "Long month," she said. He looked at her, his wife, which was a word he was going to have to practice until it felt as real in his mind as it already felt in his chest, and he said, "Are you all right?" She considered this with her usual seriousness. "I'm better than all right," she said. "Good," he said. "Are you?" she said. He thought about the sitting room with the window open and the cold air moving through. He thought about the key in his pocket, which he had left in the door when he came back downstairs. He thought about Henry's voice saying "Pa," quietly testing it, and the particular way that word had hit him square in the center of something he thought was finished. "Yeah," he said. "I am." She reached across the table, and he took her hand. They sat in the kitchen of the coal ranch on the evening of the day that changed everything, and the fire burned, and the house breathed around them, and somewhere upstairs 4 boys were asleep in rooms that had been empty for 3 years. 3 years of silence. 3 years of a house being just a house. And then a train had pulled into Cheyenne on a freezing December morning, and a woman had stepped onto a platform and looked directly at him and said, "If you want us to leave, we will." And he had picked up a bag. That was all. He had picked up a bag. And 4 months later, a locked room had a key left in its door. A bent-spectacled boy had tried out a new word for a man he was learning to trust, and a 4-year-old in his father's hat had claimed a chair at a table that had been empty far too long. Nathan Cole had spent 3 years believing that the life he'd had was the best life he was going to get, and that what came after loss was only the long, quiet business of enduring. He had been wrong. The family he never asked for turned out to be the family he had needed all along, and the lonely rancher who once feared having people to lose had discovered at last that having people to come home to was not a burden. It was the only kind of